I am so very excited to be introducing our keynote speaker, Nkechi Taifa Esquire. I had the personal pleasure of hearing her speak last year at a convention earmarked for families of lynching victims, which I do fall into that category. And I have never got to hear a case for reparations like this, and I'm so excited to be bringing that same case here to the New Jersey State Conference. I just would like to take this time to read Nkechi's bio because I want everybody to know every bit of the Black woman magic she's going to bring to this at this convention. So, Nkechi Taifa is president of the Taifa Group, LLC, a social enterprise firm whose mission is to advance justice. She's a senior fellow at Columbia University Center for Justice and convenes the Justice Roundtable, an advocacy coalition advancing progressive justice system transformation. Over the course of her career, Taifa has served as an advocacy director for criminal justice at the Open Society Foundations, Legislative and Policy Council for the American Civil Liberties Union and Women's Legal Defense Fund, founding director of Howard University's School of Law's Equal Justice Program, staff attorney for National Prison Project, network organizer for Washington Office on Africa. As a private practitioner representing adult and youth clients, and as a first grade teacher at Nation House Watoto School. Nkechi has testified before Congress, United States Sentencing Commission, Council of the District of Columbia, American Bar Association, Justice Kennedy Commission, Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and the U.S. Helsinki Commission. She was a special prosecutor delivering the opening statements in the People's Tribunal on Mumia Abu-Jamal and the People's Tribunal on Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. She served as an appointed commissioner and chair of the DC Commission on Human Rights from 2007 to 2014. An award-winning attorney, Nkechi Taifa is past president of the DC chapter of the National Conference of Black Lawyers. She is a founding member of NCOBRA, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America. She serves as a commissioner on the National African American Reparations Commissions and on the governing board of the Corrections Information Council. Nkechi Taifa is the author of a new memoir, Black Power, Black Lawyer, My Audacious Quest for Justice 2020. The book has been described as an emerging memoir of not just a fascinating woman, but a history of a movement, Kirkus reviews. She co-authored along with Dr. Imari Obadeli and attorney Chokwe Lumumba, the pioneer book, Reparations, Yes, in 1987. She is also the author of several classic books for children, Shining Legacy, Story Poems, and Tales for the Young, So Black Heroes Forever Will Be Sung, Three Tales of Wisdom, and The Adventures of Kojo and Ama. Without further ado, I bring to you the 2021 keynote speaker, none other than Nkechi Taifa. Please welcome her.
The human cargo was loaded on ships at a bustling wharf in the nation's capital, destined for plantations of the Deep South. Some of the enslaved pleaded for rosaries as they were rounded up, praying for deliverance. But on this day, in the fall of 1838, no one was spared. Not the 2-month-old baby and her mama, not the field hands, not the shoemakers, and not Cornelius Hawkins, who was about 13 years old when he was forced on board. The enslaved were grandmothers and grandfathers, carpenters and blacksmiths, pregnant women and ancient fathers, children and infants who were fearful, bewildered, and despairing as they saw their families and their communities ripped apart by the sale of 1838. Some children were sold without their parents, and the enslaved were dragged off by force to the ships, and others ran away, oh yeah, before they could be captured. Their panic and desperation will be mostly forgotten for more than a century, but this was no ordinary sale of enslaved people. The enslaved human beings had belonged to the nation's most prominent Jesuit priests, and they were sold, along with scores of others, to help secure the future of the premier Catholic institution of higher learning at the time known as Georgetown University. End of quote. So what happened to these 272 men, women, and children who were literally sold down the river? And what NAACP, if anything, is owed to the descendants of these enslaved and the descendants of millions of others, including those from the state of New Jersey, whose names and circumstances we may never know, or who were sold, or insured, or raped, castrated, lynched, subjected to gynecological experiments devoid of anesthesia, convict leasing, forced sterilization, syphilis, redlined, police murders, mass incarceration. What is owed, if anything, to the descendants of the enslaved, whose kidnappings and tortures and uncompensated labor helped to ensure the survival of colleges and universities and banks and corporations and industries and religious institutions and private states and, yes, local, state, and for the federal government. Thank you, New Jersey State Conference NAACP 2021 Annual Convention, for allowing me to share, as part of my earlier opening framing, an excerpt from Professor Rachel Swan's article that was published in the New York Times on April 16, 2016, chillingly describing the sale of 272 enslaved persons that ensured the future of Georgetown University. I'm so very pleased to speak and to have been asked to speak at this auspicious convening on the issue of reparations, particularly in a state where I understand was one of the top states for the Ku Klux Klan, a state that has been referred to as the slave state of the North, a state that not only opposed the Emancipation Proclamation, but the 13th Amendment as well. And the parade of horrors continues as a state which has consistently held one of the highest foreclosure rates in the country, a state with one of the widest racial wealth gaps in America, a state where police repression runs rampant, where the police killings of Earl Faison and Major Gulia Dale are just examples, a state that needs to get that strong CCRB off the ground, okay? But also accentuating the positive, a state with a city, Newark, that is heralded as one of the top organizing jurisdictions of the Black Power movement, a state where Mayor Ross Baraka is fulfilling the legacy of his father by building the Kawaida Towers in downtown Newark, a state that established an Amistad Commission that Black history be taught in New Jersey schools. And I understand the struggle still continues on that ground with respect to implementation and accountability. And just as an aside, I had some children's books that I published way back in the day, 40 years ago, as well as a reparations book that was mentioned in 1987 that I co-authored, both of which have just recently been banned by the Central York, Pennsylvania school district. So as the fight for the Amistad Commission in New Jersey and Black history being taught in the school, as that fight continues, we need to ensure that there is implementation and accountability. But again, a state, New Jersey, with several jurisdictions, Camden, Patterson, Newark, Passaic County, maybe more, those are the ones I know about, having passed resolutions in support of the federal reparations bill, not today, when reparations has become sexy and fashionable, but back in the day when the issue was on the fringes, a state where its Senator Cory Booker is the sponsor of the historic Senate Bill S-40, and a state where legislation for an historic reparations task force has been introduced. Thank you, Assemblywomen Sumter, Timberlake, and Reynolds Jackson. New Jersey, yes. I'm very honored to appear before you today. And thank you, New Jersey State Conference President Richard Smith, for your riveting President's address on the state of civil rights in New Jersey earlier, and Convention Chair Crystal Charlie Sibley, not just for your role as Convention Chair, not just for hearing me last year and inviting me here, but for your hosting of this timely conversation and your legacy as being the granddaughter of a lynching victim. But my brothers and sisters, unlike the Georgetown University and Jesuit revelations, where there was a ship's manifest with names, there's rarely evidence of identifiable descendants from the enslavement era from which to highlight not only the atrocities of the era, but its continuing vestiges and seek acknowledgement and remedy. That is why passage of the New Jersey State Reparations Task Force is so pertinent. It's past time that crimes against humanity and grievous injustices nationally and locally be opened up and scrutinized and rectified. Indeed, the history of reparations for African descendant people in the United States was once in the not too distant past, was once unthinkable by mainstream America as viable public policy. Why? I submit because much of the information about the enslavement era, its vestiges, the role of culpable parties in general has been buried for a very long time. Just as the bombing of Black Wall Street, Tulsa, Oklahoma, the massacres in Rosewood, Florida, Elaine, Arkansas, Wilmington, North Carolina, and countless others yet to be uncovered were buried. But our history must not be buried. It must not be swept under the rug. And for our white NAACP allies, we, the descendant victims, must not be the only ones to uncover and unpack it. My white colleague, Katrina Brown, she uncovered evidence that her ancestors were the largest slave trading family in U.S. history. And she documented her roots, that they brought over 10,000 Africans to the Americas in chains in her film that's called Traces of the Trade, a story from the deep north, not the deep south, okay, from the deep north. And, you know, she says that the slave trade was not just a few people taking a boat and sending it out. She said that everyone in the town lived off of slavery: the boat maker, the iron worker who made the shackles, the coopers who made the barrels to hold the rum, the distillers who took the molasses and sugar and made it into that rum. Literally, she said the whole town was dependent on the slave trade. Wealth and privilege in the United States, she said, has been amassed in large measure as a direct or indirect consequence of the institution of slavery. Not just the South, y'all. New Jersey, hello, open up that casket. It's so very critical that all this be brought out into the open, not that it not be buried. And it really reminds me of the words of Mamie Till Mobley, the mother of 14-year-old Emmett Till, who in 1955 was abducted by whites from bed in his great uncle's home, terrorized, tortured, brutally murdered, dumped into Mississippi's Tallahatchie River. The only way her son's beaten and horribly battered body could be identified because of a ring he wore on his finger. Mamie Till refused an open casket. She said, "I don't want to bury his memory under the rug." She stated emphatically, "I want to open up the casket. Open it up," she said. "I want the world to see what they did to my boy." And just as that casket was opened up for the world to see what was done to Emmett Till, today we're going to open up the casket of the legacy of enslavement, and we're going to make the case for remedy and for a racial reckoning in this country. Yup, it's time to say that word. As Ryan P. Hayward, president of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, has articulated, incredulously, it's my understanding that certain New Jersey politicians have asked him, when speaking about the pending New Jersey Reparations State Task Force, do we have to use that word? Why can't we call it something else? Oh, no, not reparations. Nah, Ryan says, this is not a time in our nation's or our state's history to be timid. It's time to stand up, he demanded. It's time to be bold. It's time to say that word. Reparations. The subject is hot. It's scalding, and at one time unthinkable by mainstream America as viable public policy, yet it is only a question: should the United States government pay reparations to the descendants of Africans held as slaves? Just a question, Congressman Conyers would say to me. He said, we ask questions about everything. What's up in the space? What's underneath the water? Interesting questions, he would say. But this one has been studiously avoided. Why? The answer may be because few questions challenge society to consider 400 years of history all at once, to tunnel within our souls and to discover what we truly believe about race and equity and the value to be placed on human beings. Why shouldn't the great-great-grandchildren of those who were stripped of humanity, language, and culture, repeatedly raped and bred, forced to labor for free, tortured, horrifically lynched, and then after so-called emancipation, slavery being continued by another name as convict leasing and the peonage system and the chain gangs and the stripped of land and denied the benefits of the homestead Act, and victimized by apartheid Jim Crow and massacred wholesale and Black enclave townships, relegated to substandard housing, exacerbated by redlining, denied the benefits of the GI Bill, subjected to inferior and false education, inundated with disparate health care, imperiled to a mass incarceration unmatched in the world, economically dispossessed, disenfranchised, and still being subjected today to blatant voter suppression. Why should our people not be compensated? Ask one question and invariably leads to another and yet another, and then a few more. Why should white American taxpayers who never enslaved people or lynched people or participated in redlining, why should they pay for the sins of ancestors they never knew? What about those whites who arrived long after chattel enslavement period? Why should the federal government pay? What about states and cities and corporations and religions and academic institutions, private estates? Hasn't the United States already paid reparations through affirmative action? What type of price tag should be put on over 2 centuries of legalized inhumanity? What about Oprah? She should get a check. Okay, y'all, if nothing else, one answer is crystal clear. Reparations is a well-established principle of both domestic and international law, which the United States government is very much well aware of and has participated in. It is payment for injury, redress for wrong done. And part of that remedy is why we're here today, because reparations is not solely an economic concept. It is a political one as well, and cultural and psychological. The harms were multifaceted, thus the remedies must be as well. Reparatory justice is not just limited to stolen labor, but for our stolen lives, as well. Charlie Sibley, my sister, for the stolen life of your family member. You see, the political essence of slavery was also found in the illegal imposition of U.S. jurisdiction on the enslaved and her descendants. It can never be overemphasized that Black people are on this soil as a result of warfare supported by the United States and other nations, and are here as a result of a vicious colonization, cultural and physical rape, economic exploitation under chattel and mental bondage and terror. That is the historical record, and the firm ramifications of this record, whose casket we are still opening up, must not be endlessly ignored. Open up that casket. Reparations is an issue whose time has come. Today is exactly 32 years after the introduction of H.R. 40 by Congressman John Conyers in 1989. And I remember the time vividly. I was an integral part of organizations and individuals that came together 2 years before that to found NCOBRA, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America. But you know, my personal journey began long before that. Mine actually started in the early 70s as a high school teenager selling Black Panther newspapers on the streets of Washington, D.C. And one day after tired of selling, I, took a break and I sat down on the curb. I actually opened up the paper and read through the issue. And there was a page, the page that was called What We Want, What We Believe. And I just could not get point number 3 out of my mind, out of my 16-year-old mind. It said that we believe that this racist government has robbed us. And now we are demanding the overdue debt of 40 acres and 2 mules. I'm not sure where the 2 came from, but 40 acres and 2 mules promised 100 years ago as restitution for slave labor and mass murder of Black people. We will accept the payment in currency, which will be distributed to our many communities. The Germans are now aiding the Jews in Israel for the genocide of the Jewish people. The Germans murdered 6 million Jews. The American racist has taken part in the slaughter of over 50 million Black people. Therefore, we feel this is a modest demand that we make. Sitting on that curb that day, I didn't know about those masks. I didn't know about Rosewood then and all of that, Wilmington Tulsa. I didn't know about that. I didn't know about the women who were experimented on for gynecological reasons without any anesthesia. I didn't know about the enormous profits made by corporations and insurance companies and the banking and investment industries and the academic and religious institutions from slavery. I didn't know about any of that. But on a psychic level, I could feel in my bones the enslavement era's inhumane cruelty to Black children, its destruction of our family ties, its economic exploitation, its cultural deprivation. And there was an incessant gnawing in my soul for amends and for redress. I was passionate. I always been passionate, y'all, about injustice. And I felt that the idea of reparations to be reasonable and fair. So I vowed to talk about it whenever and wherever I could. My analysis, however, had not matured beyond just a chat. But however, Rachel and Crystal and Brother Zaid and Larry Ham and all the other New Jersey luminaries out there, Reverend Lucata in Jume and all, just to verbalize the word reparations was a starting point to its validity. And so talk about it I did, despite my views being often rejected or ridiculed or otherwise summarily dismissed. So standing on the street corner that afternoon, little did I realize that some 50 years later, kind of old, I would be in the company of some of the leading academicians, economists, historians, attorneys, psychiatrists, political people, and more, domestically and internationally, promoting the right to and the need for reparations. But the demand for reparations in the United States, it didn't start when I was 16 years old. And let me tell you, the claim certainly did not drop from the sky with Ta-Nehisi Coates' brilliant article, The Case for Reparations, or Nicole Hannah-Jones' articles in the New York Times, both of which have opened up that casket for a new generation to learn and hear about this issue. But indeed, there's really been no time in our history when the call for redress was not passionately voiced. There was Belinda Royal back in the 1700s petitioning the court for a pension from the proceeds of her former enslaver's estate. There were newly freed Black people who worked closely with General Sherman in fashioning the concept of 40 acres, only to have it stripped away by Andrew Johnson. There was Callie House and Isaiah Dickinson in the late 1800s who founded the first mass-based reparations movement in the US, the National Ex-Slave Mutual Bounty and Pension Association, which my NAACP colleagues had over 600,000 dues-paying members demanding compensation from federal agencies. It was Marcus Garvey during the early part of the 20th century talking about repatriation, not swimming in the ocean naked, but with redress. And one of his followers, who became known as Queen Mother Otley Moore, kept the issue alive her entire life, sparking what I call the modern era reparations movement, influencing the Nation of Islam, James Foreman and Martin Luther King from the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Panther Party, the Republic of New Africa, the National Black United Front, Congressman John Conyers, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, the National African American Reparations Commission, the Movement for Black Lives, and countless others. And I was influenced and became a part of many of these movements. Yes, the demand for reparatory justice in the United States has been long and continuous. And quiet as is kept, y'all. Reparations were in fact paid as slavery ended. They just weren't paid to Black folk. Reparations were paid to the former white slave owners to compensate them for the loss of their so-called property. We need to open up that casket. That's what needs to be taught in the school. They talking about banning my books from the schools. Those are the things, the true history is what needs to be taught, you know, in the schools, as opposed to this whitewash, brainwash version that we've been inundated with. Okay, so reparations, what is it? Reparations are forms of compensation provided to those who have suffered human rights abuses or other forms of widespread systemic injustices, or to their descendants, usually in the aftermath of war, slavery, or other forms of gross injustice. Reparations is a well-established principle of both international and domestic law. It is not begging for a handout. It is not welfare. It is not ordinary public policy. It is payment for a debt owed. It is repair. And in the context of Black people in the United States, I submit that the quest for reparations essentially constitutes 4 elements. Number 1, the formal acknowledgement of historical wrong and an official unfettered apology. Why do I say unfettered? Because the Senate and House of Representatives did pass symbolic resolutions apologizing for slavery and segregation. However, the 2009 bill passed by the Senate contained a disclaimer. It said that those seeking reparations or cash compensation could not use that apology to support a legal claim against the United States. The audacity. Number 2, the recognition that the injury has continued throughout the years and still manifests today. Now, this provision is really pertinent because you see, the harm did not end with the 13th Amendment. The harms are generational. And in addition to the wealth gap and the redlining and the educational inequities, etc., there's also something called transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. The trauma, my NAACP brothers and sisters, the trauma traveled in our DNA. There was a study done of 3rd-generation Holocaust survivors. Researchers found that they had inherited genes that had been transformed as a result of their ancestors' trauma, and that they suffered health deficits as a result. So, what about Black folk? Our people have inherited centuries of trauma as a result of not only the enslavement era, but everything else. There are reasons why our people are dying disproportionately from the coronavirus. Number 3, the commitment to redress by the federal government, which sanctions the enslavement and subsequent vestiges, and by states, cities, corporations, and industries, academic and religious institutions, and private estates, which continue the injustices and enjoy unjust enrichment. And number 4, the actual compensation in whatever form or forms are agreed upon. And moreover, the United States must adhere to the 5 internationally accepted norms for reparations, inclusive of the requirements of cessation, cease and stop the harm, stop it. Cessation and guarantees of non-repetition, restitution, compensation, satisfaction, and rehabilitation. Thankfully, I'm no longer amongst the isolated, the Black Power fringe, okay, talking about the issue of reparations. The concept is no longer on the fringes. With me are organizations such as y'all, the NAACP, the ACLU, Human Rights Watch, their religious organizations, their sororities and fraternities, their professional organizations, their civic groups. There's the U.S. Conference of Mayors, there's state and local jurisdictions across the country. There's Amalgamated Bank. There's the Players Coalition of professional athletes and coaches and owners across leagues. Even Ben and Jerry's Ice Cream has issued a call to other corporations to be vocal. I'm waiting for them to give me some ice cream and do some kind of reparations flavor. But again, once again, kudos to New Jersey. Kudos to New Jersey, because indeed, some of the most poignant reparations graphics come from demonstration posters right out of New Jersey, courtesy of Larry Ham's People's Organization for Progress. I mean, every time I Google something up and I need an image, I hope I don't get sued, but I come up with all his great, those great images of reparation demonstration posters. Thank you. Repair. 1987 legislation was passed in this country authorizing the payment of $20,000 to each Japanese American detention camp survivor, a trust fund to be used to educate Americans about the sufferings of Japanese Americans during World War II, a formal apology from the United States government, and a pardon for all those who resisted detention camp internment. Y'all, it's a sad commentary that the United States government has not taken responsibility for its role in the enslavement era of post-slavery segregation of millions, much less issue an official unfettered apology. So formal acknowledgement, recognition that the injury continues, commitment to redress by the federal government, by state and local governments, et cetera, and the actual compensation. But why the federal government? People have asked me. Wasn't the injury all done by the states? Oh yeah, states were culpable. Y'all look at the bill for the New Jersey State Reparations Task Force. You see a lot of the culpability of New Jersey in there. But with respect to the federal government, we must remember the origins of the Black nation in the United States. We are the descendants of Africans kidnapped and transported to the United States with the explicit complicity of the United States government and every arm of the United States lawmaking and law enforcing machinery, U.S. federal law, state law, high court decisions, lower court decisions, the dehumanization, the atrocities, and the terrorism of our enslavement in the United States. They were not isolated instances, but they were a matter of war. War conducted under the specific authority of the United States Constitution. The kidnapping was a wrongful act for which our ancestors and we as their heirs are entitled to damages. The enslavement was a wrongful act for which our ancestors and we as their heirs are entitled to damages. The stealing of our labor was a wrongful act, as was the genocide that we are still suffering. We are entitled to damages, to reparations, to reparatory justice. The compensations we speak of are owed to us. They stole us, they sold us, they owe us. Thank you, Zaid. U.S. Constitutional Article 1, Clause 1, Section 9, expressly guaranteed and sanctioned the importation of kidnapped African prisoners of war. That's what we were, y'all. We weren't brought over here as slaves. We were brought over here as prisoners of war. We are an African people, and our history did not start with enslavement. We were African prisoners of war, and the Constitution guaranteed our continued kidnapping and importation until the year 1808. And that article also upheld the further dehumanization of the African by delegating our status to that of 3/5 of a white man. And most egregiously, it was war conducted against the African on this soil under the authority of yet another constitutional provision, Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3, also known as the Fugitive Slave Provision, which mandated that no African, even if he or she had reached a free state, none of us was safe. And it was the duty, it was the legal obligation, it was the constitutional responsibility of every single white man, woman, or child to track down the escaped African and deliver us up to the United States government. You see, this is why redress from the federal government is so very important. Every time we ran away, my brothers and sisters, it didn't matter if we just slipped away quietly in the night, Harriet Tubman. It didn't matter if we organized elaborate insurrections, Demarvisi. It didn't matter if we fled to Pennsylvania or New York. They were going to come after us with their armed forces, their patty rollers, their militia, and their dogs. Why didn't it matter, y'all? Because the white folk had decided that they were going to live here Wasn't gonna be no 100 years of Palmares liberation, no Ganga Zumbi here. They vowed that they would not just let us walk off into the woods and swamps and develop our own and they go back to France and England and Spain because it got too hot. This was not gonna be their vacation spot. They planned to stay. So they chased us and they pursued us and they tracked us down and they beat us and they castrated us and they lynched us and they sought and they still are seeking to quell all forms of resistance. The 13th Amendment, passed in 1865, recognized the freedom of all enslaved Africans, made it illegal to continue slavery, except for that ridiculous except as punishment for crime clause, but that's the subject of a whole another presentation. But no payment, however, was made for stolen land, labor, rape, exploitation. In fact, Dred Scott case, y'all, had been decided scarcely 8 years prior to the 13th Amendment, in which the Supreme Court Justice ruled that a Black person in America had no rights, which a white person was bound to respect, and that neither Dred Scott nor any other Black person could be a citizen in the United States in the manner in which that word was used in the Constitution. You see, when they wrote the preamble, we the people, they were talking about we, the white people. So the 13th Amendment set no restrictions on the freedom of formerly enslaved people. The 14th Amendment, however, passed 2.5 years later, robbed the African of some of their hard-won freedom. You see, we don't learn it this way in school. We only learn it one way. But actually, the 14th Amendment imposed the obligations of U.S. citizenship upon the African in America without his or her informed consent or the benefits of that citizenship, and without any meaningful discussion of political alternatives inherent in the international right to self-determination. The audacity. How are you going to take a free people and tell them that they got to be part of your family, especially since you had castrated his father, raped his mother, sold the children off to your relatives? You didn't ask him if he wanted to join your family. You didn't ask him if he wanted to start his own family if the African were free. And so far, there's been no debate as to the authenticity of the 13th Amendment. No one, not even the ex-slaveholder, could define the African's future status for him and impose a status upon him. This was the newly freed peoples. This was the Africans' decision alone. This was the fruit of the right to self-determination. And that's why it's important, my brothers and sisters, to understand that reparations is not solely an economic concept. It is a political concept as well, and a cultural one. Reparations are not limited to stolen labor, but also for that unjust war and cultural aggression as well. It can never be overemphasized that Black people on this soil as the result of warfare, supported by the United States and other nations, and are here as a result of colonization, exploitation, under chattel and mental bondage and terror, and the full ramifications of this historical record must not be endlessly ignored. So my brothers and sisters, when we see that video, you remember a couple of years ago, of the ruthless pursuit, chasing, and blatant gunning down of Walter Scott in South Carolina and Ahmaud Arbery just last year in Florida like runaway slaves. When we see the gunning down of Michael Brown in Ferguson like a dog in the street. When we see Major Gulia Dale in a mental health crisis killed by Newton police. When we see Earl Faison dying in police custody less than an hour after being arrested. When we see George Floyd murdered by a knee to his neck, and the countless others, all by those who have been sworn to uphold the law, we know there is a connection between the U.S. criminal punishment system, Rick Robinson, and the necessity for reparatory justice. There is a connection between the disparities in the healthcare system and the necessity for reparatory justice. There's a connection between the lack of economic opportunity and the necessity for reparatory justice. There is a connection between the post-traumatic slavery syndrome and post-incarceration stress syndrome and the necessity for reparatory justice. There is a connection. And each harm must be compensated. And it is past time that the roles of government at all levels be emphasized. We also hear, I'm innocent. I should not be held liable for the things that happened 100 years ago. That was my great-great-grandfather. In fact, I'm a liberal. I voted for Obama. These are white folks talking. Well, we all stand on the shoulders of those who came before us. Although the present generation of whites may be innocent of what their forefathers and foremothers, y'all, don't forget, forefathers and foremothers did, as a people, they are in a privileged position because of the actions of their predecessors. Each generation passes its debts as well as its assets on to the next generation. The heritage which whites enjoy in this country is what has been called white skin privilege. They benefit from a society, a state, and economic structure which is governed by white supremacy. And although we may debate methods of operationalizing this data for measurement, there is no question that Caucasians in this country enjoy the fruits of 400 years of unjust enrichment as a result of the stolen labor of African people. Another question. Well, what about new immigrants to this country who have no blood or other connection to the enslavement or Jim Crow eras? Should they also have to pay? Newcomers are entitled to all the rights, privileges, and benefits of American citizenship once they become citizens, in addition to the debts and responsibilities of the country. America does not say to its new citizens, because you have no ancestral connection to this country, you cannot vote, sue in court, or enter into contracts. Everyone pays the debt, regardless as to whether or not they had anything to do with creating it. They are benefiting from the enrichment from it by being here in this country. Those who question the need for reparations often ask, well, what about affirmative action? Doesn't affirmative action make it all right? Well, I remember Congressman Craig Washington way back in the day from Texas being quoted on the floor of the House of Representatives when arguing in support of the Civil Rights Act of 1990. He said, nobody's asking for reparations. I'm just asking you to give us the crumbs from the table. And despite the fact that when compared to the debt owed, affirmative action is indeed only crumbs from the table. Another question. Slavery ended over a century ago. Why should the government pay reparations now? The answer is succinct. It should be paid because it is old. Had it been paid before, there would be no past due debt now. There is no statute of limitations on redressing human rights violations. And guess what, y'all? Debts are neither absolved nor diminished by the passage of time. In fact, over time, y'all know you got them credit cards. Over time, debts grow larger with interest. Now the jackpot question, the doozy elephant in the room, is reparations just about the money? Well, Professor, the author of The West and the Rest of Us, he said, no, reparations is not just about the money. It is not even mostly about money. In fact, money may not be 1% of what reparatory justice is all about. He said reparations is mostly about making repairs, mental repairs, psychological repairs, cultural repairs, organizational repairs, social repairs, institutional repairs, technological repairs, economic repairs, political repairs, educational repairs, justice system repairs, health repairs. Indeed, a reparations settlement can come in as many forms as necessary to equitably address the many forms of injury sustained by slavery in its continued vestiges. Again, the harms were multifaceted, the remedies must be as well. And although I wholeheartedly believe that cash payments must remain an important and necessary component of any claim for damages, a reparations settlement can be fashioned in as many ways as necessary. Some forms may include closing the Black-white wealth gap. It can include land, economic development, repatriation resources, truthful textbooks like mine, which they banned in York, Pennsylvania. Still others my books that were banned are coming out again within a couple of weeks, so be on the lookout out for them. I'll put my whatever in the chat, but anyway. Still other remedies could include the erection of monuments and museums, clemencies, repairing the harms from the war on drugs that go beyond basic public policy, pardons for political prisoners from the COINTELPRO area. You see, we must not just tinker with just one area or one claim. It ain't just about the black-white wealth gap, y'all, but it's about all their SHIT. We got to continuously open up the casket. And this one might have passed you, freedom for our political prisoners as part of a reparations settlement. Not as far-fetched as you might think. The Japanese American Reparations Bill, the fourth prong, was a pardon for all those who resisted detention, camp, interment. There is precedent. They've done it before. They can do it again. Y'all saw Judas and the Black Messiah about the COINTELPRO. This war that's continuing being waged is a war that is continuing from the COINTELPRO era to stop the rise of a Messiah, to expose, misdirect, discredit, and otherwise neutralize the activities of Black nationalists and their organizations and their leadership and their spokespeople and their supporters. Neutralization, this is the FBI talking. That is a term of war. This war, it is a war of genocide that's been waged against our people, and when our freedom fighters are captured, fighting against or defending against this war of genocide, they should be free. And you might say, Nikichi, okay, you're going a little bit too far. Genocide, Black people have not been annihilated like the Native peoples. Genocide, Nikichi, Black people have not been burned in the ovens like the Jews. Brothers and sisters, we must untrack our colonized minds. We need to look at what is already there in print. The definition of genocide in not only international law, but in the US Code is killing members of a group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about their destruction in whole or in part. That's the definition. And you're going to tell me that doesn't relate to us? So that brings me, as we're coming to a close, to Sundiata Acoli, racially profiled, stopped on the New Jersey Turnpike. Now, an 84-year-old elder nearing the 50-year mark of incarceration, denied parole 8 times, a COVID-19 survivor battling early stage dementia. It is time for Sundiata Acoli to come home. How about a New Jersey down payment on reparations in the form of a gubernatorial pardon? They did it for the Japanese Americans. There is precedent. I want everybody to pull out your phones right now. Pull out these devices right now and type in the website sundiataacoli.org. That's Sundiata, SUNDIATA, Acoli, ACOLI. FC.org. That's Sundiata Acoli Freedom Campaign.org. Sundiata Acoli FC.org. Sign the petition to your governor, Governor Murphy, calling for clemency for Sundiata Acoli. Submit the digital postcard that's there on the website. And while you're on the website, check out those beautiful paintings that this imprisoned human being has done over the decades. Let's bring Sundiata Acoli home. Reach out to Zaid Muhammad from NAACP, who can provide you any and all information you need to know. SundiataAcoliFC.org. So, in closing, woo, y'all got me fired up. My heart is full. There's unquestionably a racial reckoning happening in this country and in the state of New Jersey in this day, at this time. The winds of change are shifting in favor of reparations. The casket is being thrust wide open. It's not just the manifest of names from the Georgetown 272, from that ship's manifest. There are increasing examples of historic harms being uncovered with initiatives to right these wrongs as we speak. This is history in the making right here, y'all. New Jersey, y'all could have had that first state reparations task force. You introduced that bill like they got introduced before the California bill got introduced. Okay, history is being made right now as we speak. A month does not go by without me hearing of new manifestations of vestiges from the enslavement era to be addressed. Reparations, it's not history, a thing of the past. Convention Chair Crystal Charlie Sibley, she is a living example. Where's the justice for her lynched grandfather? Reparations, it's about historical justice. And until justice is done, reparations will always be relevant. It will always be a righteous struggle. And be on the lookout for my new book on reparations coming out early next year, that I would like to be able to say in that book that New Jersey has passed its state commission reparations task force, that I'll be able to state that the CCRB has whatever it needs to be firmly, established, that Amistad commission is implemented and held accountable, that those Kawaida towers are up there, erected, and everything that and that Sunyata Koli has been free. So again, thank you. I'm Nikichi Taifa, the author of Black Power, Black Lawyer, My Audacious Quest for Justice. It's been my privilege and my honor to address you this morning.
Wow, amazing, 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 my sister Nkichi. We thank you so, so much. I mean, oh gosh, I don't even know what to say. I just don't even know what to say, but I will say this. They stole us, they sold us, and they owe us, New Jersey. They stole us, they sold us, and they owe us. Black Power, Black Lawyer, My Audacious Quest for Justice. Get your copy today. Right now, I see 102 participants on, so I know that means 102 books are going off the shelf right now. On your break, go order your book, okay? So thank you again so much, my sister. Please come see us again. We hope that we'll be able to give you the report for which you are seeking to put in your new book. And we will also be sure to make sure we get a copy of that book as well. Thank you again. Thank you so much, so much, so much. And I will turn it over to our tech team.
Well, before we have such an amazing keynote. We have a few minutes. Madam Chair, could we get a little information? There's a lot of activity in the chat. I think you've definitely inspired and you've galvanized our group. Can you give us some instructions on how people can go about getting more involved in the fight for reparations in their respective locations?
Oh, yes, absolutely. If there's been no other time, this is the time for people who want to get involved, because there's so much going on right here, right there where you are in New Jersey. You need to get with the people who are mobilizing behind the state commission coming up. I spoke about the brother from the social justice committee. I talked about Brother Zaid, Brother Reverend Luke. Look out, my brain is just going. But there's loads of stuff happening in Jersey. Larry Ham, People's Organization for Progress. But then nationally, there are organizations like in Cobra, www.incobraonline.org with loads of resources. HR 40, there are more co-sponsors to the federal reparations bill than there's ever been in history. It needs to pass. Okay, there needs to be a floor vote, and there needs to be an executive order signed, because we all know what's happening in the Senate right now. There needs to be an executive order passed by the president that signs HR 40 into existence so that the federal commission can get up and running. There's so many ways for people to plug in right now. Just Google the word reparations and things will come up. But again, check out Incoba, check out your local resources there in New Jersey as well.
And one more question, really quickly. There seems to be a generational divide when it comes to reparations, and I just want to see if you can help us address how do we bring in different people to understand that this is something that we all should be fighting for, because we've definitely seen a generational divide when it comes to the subject of reparations.
Well, interesting. I was 16 years old when I first was introduced to the issue, and it lit a fire within me. And now I guess I'm an elder, okay, and I'm still trying to light that fire. I mean, the young people today need to see the relevance to what they are doing, what's going on. Many of them are very much concerned about issues of climate change. There's a direct connection between that and Black communities, environmental issues, and the disproportionate impact on Black people. Young people were the ones that are out there in the streets while I was at home trying not to catch coronavirus. And folk were out in the streets protesting in the middle of a health pandemic. Okay, they need to see the connection between that and the historical continuum from the enslavement era and the chain gangs and all like that down to the police killings and mass incarceration. So when these connections are made, I think we begin to close that gap that's there. We just need to make sure that we are part of making those connections and making sure that the youth, I think I heard earlier, and that young brother, oh my God, who sang, I don't even usually listen, I have never heard Lift Every Voice and sing as beautifully as that brother Bender did. So I mean, I'm just saying our youth are here. And they're doing great things. And it's incumbent upon organizations like the NAACP to ensure that they are part of the advocacy that you're doing. And I think that they are doing that. Also, there needs to be some rap songs about reparations. I mean, there's some out there. We need to have a Stevie Wonder reparations song, like we had Happy Birthday for Martin Luther King's birthday. I mean, there's so many avenues that can be cultivated to really make sure that this next generation takes this up, just as the older generation that I came from carried on the banner from the Queen Mother Moores and the Callie Houses and the Marcus Garveys and the like.
Well, thank you again so much and taking the time to answer those few questions and just really bringing this case on home for so many. So I just want to thank you again for your time, and we look forward to having you back with us in New Jersey State Conference again in the very near future. Thank you again, Nkechi.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.